We begin with a story that has nothing to do with missiles, borders, or bank bailouts. It's about something sitting in your kitchen right now. A pale golden liquid so common, so inexpensive, and so completely taken for granted that its sudden disappearance from global markets has accomplished what no tariff, no sanction, and no diplomatic ultimatum ever could. It has shattered the American snack industry in real time. Mark Carney just executed a sudden, unannounced move on canola oil. Not a tariff, not a formal sanction, not a strongly worded diplomatic letter sent through official channels. This was a deliberate restructuring of the global canola oil supply chain, one that touches every bag of chips, every box of crackers, every cookie, every fried item, every granola bar, and every packaged food product sitting on every shelf in every grocery store across the United States of America. The reaction inside the White House was not rage, it was bewilderment. Donald Trump was caught entirely off guard. His trade team had been tracking tariffs, energy exports, dairy supply chains, mineral restrictions, port access, all the obvious pressure points in an 18-month trade standoff. Nobody in the White House had been watching canola oil. Nobody in the administration had flagged it as a strategic vulnerability. And by the time anyone in Washington grasped what Carney had done, the contracts were already signed, the supply had already been rerouted, and the American snack industry was already scrambling to answer a question it had never once thought to ask. Where does our oil actually come from? Let's walk through exactly what happened, because the speed of execution is what made this move so devastating. Carney's announcement came with zero warning, no diplomatic preview, no leaked intelligence, no quiet signals passed through back channels to Washington. It landed as a formal policy declaration during a midweek economic briefing in Ottawa that registered on no American trade monitoring system because its subject line, domestic agricultural processing investment, read like routine infrastructure policy and nothing more. The announcement contained four specific measures, all enacted simultaneously at the moment of declaration. First, an immediate 25% reduction in canola oil export allocations to the United States, effective within 14 days. Second, a $512 million federal investment in Canadian canola, crushing and refining infrastructure designed to process raw canola seed into finished oil domestically rather than shipping unprocessed seed to American facilities. Third, preferential long-term supply agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, India, and the United Arab Emirates, locking in the volume being redirected away from American buyers. And fourth, the establishment of a new Canadian Oilseed Sovereignty Board, granted authority to set export priorities based on Canada's own strategic interests and the behavior of its trading partners. The American response was chaos. Reports surfaced within hours that Trump's trade team first learned of the announcement through a news alert, not through diplomatic channels, and that the initial reaction inside the West Wing was confusion rather than fury. One senior trade advisor reportedly asked the question that exposed the full depth of the intelligence failure. How dependent are we on Canadian canola? The answer, when it came back from the USDA 45 minutes later, was the kind of number that drains the color from a room. Canada supplies over 75% of America's canola oil imports, which in turn represent the single largest source of cooking oil used across American food manufacturing. That figure wasn't classified. It wasn't buried in obscure commodity reports. It was publicly available in the USDA's own annual publications, accessible to anyone willing to look. Nobody had looked because canola oil had always been there. Affordable, abundant, predictable. And things that have always simply been there stop registering as vulnerabilities. They become background noise. Then someone switches off the background. But before we explain the full scope of what Carney's move means for the American food system, there's something you need to know about canola oil, something that will permanently change how you read every food label for the rest of your life. The word canola is not a word from nature. It does not descend from Latin. It is not the name of a plant that has existed for centuries in the wild. The word canola was invented in 1978 by Canadian agricultural scientists. It is a portmanteau, a word constructed by fusing parts of other words together. Those words are can, from Canada, ola, from oil, and low acid, canola, Canada oil, low acid. The product was developed by researchers at the University of Manitoba who bred a new variety of rapeseed plant specifically engineered to produce an oil that was low in erucic acid and safe for human consumption at industrial scale. They named it after their country because it was a Canadian invention. A Canadian product, developed with Canadian research dollars, grown on Canadian farmland, processed in Canadian facilities, and marketed to the world as a distinctly Canadian achievement. Americans have been reading the word Canada on every snack label in their kitchen for more than 40 years and never once registered what it meant. Go to your kitchen right now, pick up any bag of chips, grab any box of cookies or crackers, reach for any bottle of cooking spray, any jar of mayonnaise, any frozen meal. Read the ingredient list. You will find canola oil. You will find it in Lay's potato chips and Ritz crackers and Oreos and Pringles and Pop-Tarts and Cheez-Its and Doritos and Nature Valley granola bars and Goldfish crackers and hundreds of other products Americans consume daily without a second thought. And every single time you read the word canola, you are reading the word Canada. The dependency was never hidden, never classified, never buried inside a supply chain document marked for internal use only. It was printed in plain English on every package, on every label, on every shelf, in every grocery store in America. The word itself told you exactly where it came from. And an entire country, an entire government, read that word every single day for 4 decades and never once asked, what happens if Canada decides this ingredient is no longer ours to take for granted? Canola oil isn't just in your snacks. It is in virtually everything the American food system produces. Every major fast food chain in the United States fries in canola oil. McDonald's, KFC, Chick-fil-A, Burger King, Wendy's, Popeyes, Five Guys, Taco Bell. It is the default commercial cooking oil from coast to coast because it offers a neutral flavor profile, a high smoke point, and a cost structure that no alternative oil can match at the volumes commercial food service demands. It is the base ingredient in commercial mayonnaise, in salad dressings, in cooking sprays, in margarine, in bread and baked goods, in breakfast cereal, in tortillas, in frozen entrees, in infant formula. It is used in cosmetics, in biodiesel production, in industrial lubricants, in animal feed. The American food system doesn't run on canola oil the way a car runs on gasoline. It runs on canola oil the way a human body runs on blood. It is in everything. It is in every meal. And 75% of it comes from Canada. The substitution problem makes the dependency functionally irreversible in any short or medium-term time frame. The theoretical alternatives, soybean oil, palm oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, each fail on at least one critical dimension. Soybean oil carries a lower smoke point and a stronger flavor that alters the taste of fried foods, and American soybean production cannot deliver the refined oil volume required even if every available soybean were diverted from all other uses. Palm oil carries severe environmental and reputational liabilities that major food brands have spent years publicly committing to reduce. A pivot to palm oil would be a brand catastrophe layered on top of a supply chain emergency. Sunflower oil remains constrained in the aftermath of the Ukraine conflict, with global output still below pre-war levels and available surplus already committed to European customers. Corn oil is produced in insufficient volume and at a price premium that would fundamentally restructure the economics of every product currently formulated with canola. There is no drop-in replacement for canola oil at the volume, the price point, the quality grade, and the flavor neutrality the American food system requires. None. The dependency is not a preference. It is a structural reality that would take a decade and tens of billions of dollars in agricultural investment to even begin to dismantle. Now let's explain precisely what Carney engineered, because this move was designed to become impossible to reverse before anyone understood it was already in motion. The 25% export reduction was the visible headline. The real weapon was the $512 million investment in domestic Canadian crushing capacity. Canada has historically exported a large share of its canola as raw, unprocessed seed, shipped to American and international crushing facilities that extract the oil and sell the finished product to food manufacturers. Carney's investment upended that model entirely. Instead of exporting raw seed for Americans to process, Canada would now process the seed on Canadian soil, producing finished canola oil in Canadian facilities and selling the finished product directly to global buyers under preferential terms. The effect was to move Canada up the value chain from raw commodity exporter to finished product supplier, while simultaneously cutting American processors out of the supply pipeline. The preferential supply agreements compounded the damage exponentially. The EU agreement alone committed 1.3 million metric tons of Canadian canola oil annually, roughly 30% of Canada's total exportable production, to European food manufacturers at prices 7 to 11% below prevailing market rates. The Japanese and South Korean agreements added another 800,000 metric tons. The Indian agreement, the largest single agricultural trade deal between the two countries in history, committed 600,000 metric tons at preferential rates tied to a broader strategic partnership encompassing fertilizer, pulses, and agricultural technology transfer. By the time American food manufacturers grasped the scope of the redirection, the math had already turned catastrophic. The available canola oil on the open market, the supply American buyers had always purchased without contracts because it had always simply been there, had been reduced by over 40%. Not because Canada had stopped producing canola, because Canada had redirected it to buyers who signed contracts, secured preferential pricing, and locked in their supply before America knew it needed securing. When reporters asked Carney about the canola move at a press conference in Ottawa the following day, with the American snack industry already in emergency mode and Trump's trade team still piecing together its first comprehensive briefing on canola dependency, Carney delivered 10 words that will define this chapter of the trade confrontation. A Globe and Mail reporter asked, "Prime Minister, American food manufacturers are calling this an act of economic warfare. What is your response?" Carney paused. He looked at the reporter with an expression that combined the precision of a former central banker with the composure of a man who has been holding a winning hand and has finally chosen to lay it down. And he said, "The label always said Canada. Nobody in Washington reads labels." 10 words, 2 sentences. The first sentence is a statement of fact so elementary it cannot be challenged. Canola literally means Canada. The word has appeared on every American grocery store label for 4 decades. The second sentence is a devastating indictment of institutional blindness, delivered as dry observation rather than aggressive provocation. Nobody in Washington reads labels, not a boast, not an insult, a diagnosis. The wit made it more lethal than drama ever could have. It landed not as a threat, but as a truth so self-evident that the only possible response was the silence of recognition. Within 20 minutes, the quote was trending in 11 countries. Within an hour, it was the headline on Bloomberg, the Financial Times, the BBC, Le Monde, the Washington Post, and every major Canadian outlet. Simultaneously, social media detonated with photos of snack labels. The words canola oil circled in red, alongside Carney's 10 words. The meme format was instantaneous and perfect. A split screen, an ingredient list, a map of Canada, and Trump's blank social media feed. Late-night hosts opened their monologues with it. One commentator called it the most efficient dismantling of a trade position in the history of live television. Being caught off guard is worse than fury and worse than silence. It is the one reaction that cannot be reframed, cannot be spun, cannot be converted into strength. When Trump lashed out over the energy suspension, his supporters could frame the anger as fighting spirit, a president defending American interests with conviction. When Trump went quiet over the dairy move, his communications team could package the silence as strategic restraint. A president choosing his moment carefully. Being caught off guard admits neither strength nor strategy. It admits only that the administration had failed to monitor a dependency that was printed on every food label in the country, was publicly documented in the USDA's own annual reports, and was literally named after the nation that supplies it. You cannot claim preparation when the warning was inscribed in the product's own name. You cannot claim strategic patience when your trade team was Googling canola oil supply chains while the Canadian Prime Minister was already fielding questions at a press conference. The consequences reached the American snack industry before the White House had finished drafting its first formal response. Canola oil futures surged 19% in the first week following the announcement, the single largest weekly increase in oilseed markets since the Ukraine conflict disrupted global sunflower oil supply. Frito-Lay, The PepsiCo subsidiary that manufactures Lay's, Doritos, Cheetos, Tostitos, and Ruffles issued an emergency supply chain review and warned investors of material input cost increases that would necessitate pricing adjustments across its North American snack portfolio. Mondelez International, parent company of Oreo, Ritz, Chips Ahoy, Triscuit, and Wheat Thins, filed force majeure notices with three of its canola oil suppliers and announced it was evaluating all alternative oil sources, language that industry analysts recognized immediately as an admission that no adequate substitute currently existed at the required scale. General Mills, Kellogg's, Campbell's, Kraft Heinz, and a dozen other major food manufacturers issued variations of the same statement within days, each acknowledging supply chain disruption, each warning of potential price increases, each carefully refraining from blaming Canada, and each implicitly indicting the trade environment that had made the disruption possible. The fast food sector was hit simultaneously and with equal force. McDonald's alone consumes an estimated 200 million pounds of canola oil annually across its U.S. operations, and its supply contracts were among the first affected by the global reallocation. Restaurant industry analysts projected fast food menu price increases of 6 to 14% within 90 days if the disruption held, with the steepest increases concentrated in fried food categories, which represent the majority of fast food revenue. A McDonald's franchise operator in Indiana with 6 locations calculated that the canola price spike would add over $350,000 to his annual operating costs. A family-owned restaurant in Chicago that had been running for 31 years said they were weighing closure. Their cooking oil costs had doubled in 3 weeks, and no realistic menu price increase could compensate without pushing away the loyal customers they had spent 3 decades earning. A food truck operator in Austin put it with the exhausted clarity of someone who had simply run out of patience for geopolitical explanations. I fry things for a living. That's the entire business. I fry things in canola oil because it's the right oil for frying and it's always been affordable. Now it's not affordable because 2 governments are fighting each other. Nobody asked me if I wanted to be in this fight. I'm just the guy standing next to the fryer. The domestic political fracture followed the same pattern every previous Canadian precision strike had produced. Fury directed not at Canada, but at the White House, concentrated precisely in the industries, states, and voter demographics the administration could least afford to alienate. The Snack Food Association, representing over 400 manufacturers, issued a statement that was exactly 1 sentence longer than necessary. That final sentence contained the entire political indictment. We urge the administration to resolve the trade dispute that has created this crisis before it dismantles the industry that feeds America's families. The trade dispute that created this crisis. Not Canada's move, the trade dispute, the administration's trade dispute. Republican members of Congress from agricultural and food manufacturing states began releasing statements demanding an immediate reassessment of trade strategies that had placed American food security at risk. Language any constituent could translate as, "The president's trade war is making your snacks more expensive." The American Farm Bureau Federation published figures showing that American canola farmers, yes, the U.S. grows canola too, primarily in North Dakota, Montana, and Minnesota, were being devastated by the global price restructuring. Canadian canola was now flowing to higher-paying international buyers, while American farmers faced a collapsing domestic processing infrastructure that could no longer source affordable raw materials. The trade war was hurting American farmers who grew the same crop Canada had just turned into a weapon. The irony was so precise it felt engineered. International reaction confirmed that Carney had once again created a template other nations would study and replicate. Trade ministers from 12 countries requested briefings from Canadian officials on the strategic agricultural investment model. The European Commission published a working paper within 10 days, citing the canola move as evidence that asymmetric trade strategies targeting invisible supply chain dependencies represent the most significant evolution in economic statecraft since the invention of targeted financial sanctions. Brazil's agricultural minister stated publicly that his country was evaluating which agricultural exports constituted strategic leverage that had been undervalued in trade negotiations, language that every trade analyst in Washington recognized as a signal that the Carney doctrine was spreading. Canada had not simply made a move against the United States, it had demonstrated to every mid sized agricultural exporter in the world that the ingredients hiding in plain sight on American food labels were potential pressure points waiting to be activated. The consumer reaction was unlike anything the previous rounds of this trade confrontation had generated. Because the canola crisis arrived with a built in public engagement mechanism that no communications strategist could have engineered more effectively. Within 72 hours of Carney's quote going viral, Check Your Labels had become a social media movement crossing every demographic, every political affiliation, every age group. Millions of Americans walked to their kitchens, picked up the snacks they had eaten their entire lives, and read the ingredient list for the very first time. The photos flooded every platform: Lay's, Oreos, Pringles, Pop-Tarts, Cheez-Its, Nature Valley, Ritz, Goldfish. Every package confirming the same two words, canola oil. Polling conducted within 8 days found that 71% of Americans had personally checked a food label for canola oil since the crisis began. And 63% said they had not previously known what the word canola actually meant. The most politically damaging figure, 59% of respondents said the crisis had made them less confident in the government's ability to protect American food security, a sentiment that crossed party lines and registered equally among Republican and Democratic voters. The label check didn't just educate consumers, it transformed every kitchen in America into physical evidence of government failure. A tangible, holdable, undeniable proof that the dependency was real was printed in plain English and had been ignored by every person in Washington whose professional responsibility was to see it coming. So here is where things stand. Mark Carney executed a sudden, unannounced move on canola oil. A $512 million investment in Canadian processing capacity, combined with a 25% export reduction and preferential supply agreements with the EU, Japan, South Korea, India, and the UAE, redirected over 40% of the globally available canola oil supply away from American buyers. Canola futures spiked 19%. Every major snack manufacturer in America issued supply chain warnings. Fast food chains projected menu price increases of 6 to 14%. Franchise operators began calculating whether their businesses could survive. Trump was caught completely off guard because nobody in Washington had been tracking an ingredient that was printed on every food label in the country and was literally named after the country that produces it. And Carney stood at a podium in Ottawa and delivered 10 words that are now on the front page of every major newspaper in the world. The label always said Canada. Nobody in Washington reads labels. The question that should follow every American from the grocery store to the ballot box, from the snack aisle to the voting booth, is this: how many other dependencies are hiding in plain sight? Printed on labels, embedded in supply chains, named after the countries that control them, visible to anyone willing to look, waiting for someone to finally notice, waiting for the day that always available becomes no longer available, and the country that never read the label discovers what it always said. Trump constructed a trade strategy on the assumption that economic scale equals economic security, that the largest economy can always absorb the most pain, apply the most pressure, and outlast any smaller adversary. Carney built a trade strategy on the understanding that economic security is not about size. It is about knowledge, about knowing which ingredients actually matter, which dependencies are real, which supply chains are brittle, and which labels contain information the other side has never bothered to read. A $512 million investment in canola processing capacity, less than the cost of a single aircraft carrier, less than a rounding error in the federal budget, has just fractured the American snack industry, threatened the cost structure of every fast food chain in the country, and proven that the most powerful economy on earth can be outmaneuvered by a country 1/10 its size that simply understood the supply chain better. Not because Canada is larger, not because Canada is more powerful, because Canada read the label. And the label that was always there on every package, in every store, in every kitchen in America, always said exactly where the oil came from. It said Canada, 3 letters, right there at the start. CAN. It was never a secret. It was never concealed. It was the most visible dependency in the history of global trade, and nobody in Washington ever read it. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe for daily updates.